approaches to transportation, particularly now that we have seen the need and urgency to transition over to a clean energy economy. Transportation is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions here in Virginia. And so it exceeds electricity generation, agriculture, and all of the other sectors. And so with that, I just wanted to, next slide, please. Oh, it's me. Before I start, thanks, Gary. Before I start, I just wanted to go over a few house rules. Please mute your line, but I think Karen took care of that. We'll have a we'll try to have a question and answer session at the end of each segment. Please do not be afraid to ask any questions. There are no bad questions. Also, feel free to go ahead and just type your questions in the chat box, and please be open-minded and respectful to all of the comments and expressions that we hear tonight. Next slide, please. So we have a really packed agenda today, and here's an outline of what you'll be hearing today. With me, we have Jane English, who will be going over the equity and transportation segment of this, followed by Sean Tubbs from the Piedmont Environmental Council, who will be giving us a transportation overview and showing us the importance of making sure that as we move forward and we're doing our planning and achieving the vision of our communities, that we make sure that we integrate transportation and land use, because we can't solve one without addressing the other. And then following Sean, we'll be hearing from Danny Flopper from the Virginians for High-Speed Rail, and he's also with the Virginia Transit Association, and he'll be talking about rails, passenger rails in particular, and as well as transit. And then Trip Pollard and Kim Sandom is going to be giving us some background information on the I-81 corridor. Trip is from the Southern Environmental Law Center, and Kim is with the Alliance for the Shenandoah Valley. And then our program will conclude with closing remarks from our president, Deborah Travis. Next slide, please. But before I hand the reins over, I just wanted to give everybody a brief overview of what the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program is. This program was started about 10 years ago, and the purpose of this program was to combat the injustices and ill effects of the coal industry on communities of color, particularly African-American communities. Since then, this program has expanded, but the three main tenets and goals of this program has remained the same, which is to reduce harmful emissions, particularly greenhouse gases. And that can take many forms, whether it's shutting down or eliminating toxic toxic usage such as coal, which are huge emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, or supporting sustainable growth strategies. The second goal is advancing energy efficiency and clean energy. And the third, which is the most important and where we're going to be focusing here today, is how do we strengthen our community's resilience and livability? And one of the best ways to do so is through transportation. Transportation allows for, it's not really supposed to, we're not supposed to look at transportation as merely transporting a person or a good from one point to another, but it's also a means in socio and economic advancement by getting our better access to education, medical facilities, better jobs, and great recreation opportunities, to name a few. Next slide, please. Is that, NAACP has, over the years, have developed and published many reports and toolkits to help communities achieve those three goals that we just discussed. And here's just a highlight of just a few of the many reports that you can find online at naacp.org. And I would like to draw attention to the lights out in the cold, reframing utility shutoff policies as if human rights matter. And this is a huge issue as we're now experiencing in this COVID-19 pandemic era. You know, we need to figure out a way to get the humanity back into the way our utilities operate. And then the last one, In the Eye of the Storm, this one was developed because of what happened with Katrina, and it prepares frontline communities during disasters to be first responders and the like. Next slide, please. So we use this thing called the equity lens when we're trying to analyze and evaluate whether or not there's equity in whatever the program or service is. And so you've probably seen this, this graphic before, in which it shows this is the reality, this is what injustices look like. And if you try to make things equal and use this equality rule, it doesn't necessarily achieve the purpose. You're giving everybody the same amount. And then equity is you give resources to those who need more resources than the other. But this graphic shows, or it tries to convey, that the shorter person does not have the ability to be able to see this game, which is not true. They do. Next slide, please. What we really need to do is to remove that fence, that barrier, and what that barrier represents in these graphics are the discriminatory and the systemic practices that hinder a community from being resilient and self-reliant. And once we do that, we are able to achieve liberation or community resiliency. Next slide, please. Another way of looking at these equity lenses, you can ask three main questions. The first one is governance or procedural equity. Who's at the table and who's making the decision? This picture right here depicts, we were doing a walk-in audit in a community in South Carolina. And while we were on the audit, we were with several school children, middle school kids, and they said, you know what, you need to see how we get to school. Because if you want to see a deficiency in our sidewalk and our bike lanes within our communities, see how we walk to school. And this is a path that these kids have to take to and from school. It's you can see it's a well-worn, foot-beaten path. It's not even part of the city's sidewalk infrastructure. And we're going up a slight incline, and we're about to cross over railroad tracks. And you can see for the youngest of the young and the oldest of the old, this is a difficult path to take. So had the city reached out to this community as they're allocating resources for their sidewalks, they would have known that this community is deficient. So who's at the table and who's making the decision is very important. Second slide, please. Another thing is resource allocation. It kind of ties into what we just discussed. How are resources allocated and what are the reasons why they're not allocated? So we have these discriminatory and systemic rules and regulations and laws that are in places that the outcome is an unhealthy community, right? Whether it be the not in my backyard folks, in which all of the noxious facilities are then moved into communities of lesser political influence, or it could be, well, we are going to spend our money elsewhere and then at a later date figure out a way to rebuild this community. And that's where we have these climactic failing in our infrastructure, or underfunding schools. So where are these resources allocated? And then our next slide, please. And then what are the outcomes? Like what I was just talking about, if we have underfunded schools or poor access to adequate roadway systems, the outcome is we have a very unhealthy community. So whenever there is a disaster, who's impacted, who's resilient, who survives, and how quickly does it take for them to come back and bounce back? And where are the collateral damages? So these are some of the questions that we can use when we try to identify if equity is part of the equation. Next slide, please. And here's a great solution. This was one of the housing communities in Richmond, and you can see that they're in the process of building these raised community gardens. And this project was actually identified by a high school student. She wanted to do this, bring in some kind of agricultural infrastructure into her community. And this is transformative because not only does she have food source in a food desert or an area that has a deficient access to, inadequate access to nutritional foods, but she also has a learning tool for other children her age to teach them how to eat more healthy. So these are the types of solutions that we want for change, solutions that are not only intentional, but are transformative in its outcome. Next slide, please. And we should always try to achieve the degree of citizen participation in any decision-making process. We want to make sure that everybody is well informed, that the communication structure is two-way, and that there is citizen control in the outcomes and the final decision. Next slide, please. Okay, and so these are some of the things that Virginia State Conference is working on, and will be working on we started in 2020, and we're going to be working on these, and equity in transit, in transportation is one of them. So these are all the different things, solar equity initiative, clean air ordinances, democratizing rural electric co-ops, and all of those different things. So my contact information will be at the end of the presentation. And if you want to talk about these and more, please feel free to reach out to me. Next slide, please. And here are some of the programs that we are planning. Stay tuned. We're going to be having a statewide environmental and climate justice, as well as a statewide transportation program shortly. Next slide, please. And we can always come back to this later, but this is the contact information for everybody that's going to be presented here tonight. And we'll bring this back up at the end of the program. So either take a picture of it now to get everybody's email and name, but we'll also introduce it again later on. And so that's the end of my presentation. And so it is with my pleasure and honor to introduce you to Jane English, who is the Region 7 Coordinator for the Environmental and Climate Justice Program in National NAACP headquarters in Baltimore. And so I'm going to turn this program over to Jane. Take it away, Jane. Should we advance your slides or?
Thank you. I have them. Can I share my screen? Am I permitted to share my screen?
You should be.
Okay. First of all, thank you all for inviting me to be on this wonderful program. Karen, that's a tough act to follow. Thank you.
That's an honor.
Let's see. It says host disabled participant. Can you permit me, whoever is hosting, could you please permit me to share my screen?
Yes, just 1 second.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
So while we're doing it, would like to say to everybody, Karen Jones is the political action, just in case we have anybody who doesn't know you yet, Karen, which I find that doubtful. Karen Jones is the political action committee chair for the Montgomery, Radford, Floyd counties, NAACP, and she's also the assistant secretary for the Virginia State Conference NAACP. And I thank you for inviting us, Jane and I, and all of our presenters here today to speak to your members about transportation.
Thank you so much. Jane, it looks like, I'm not sure why it won't let you share your screen, but I do have your slides and I can do that for you if that's okay.
Okay, the first one doesn't exactly have the correct title on it, but let's roll with it.
Okay.
Okay.
I think
I can modify that.
For you though.
We'll have to fix that by June.
Yeah, that's okay. It's no big deal. The content is the same.
Yeah.
All right, just 1 second.
Thank you.
Oh, I like that.
Okay. So it does have Southwest Virginia on it. Okay. So thank you all very much. Again, Karen says my name is Jane English. I appreciate the introduction. I bring greetings from the National Office of the NAACP. Leon Russell, the chairperson of the board, Derek Derek Johnson, the President and CEO, Jackie Patterson, our Senior Director of ECJP. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start with what, and every time you click it, some other things will come up on that slide, but what is Transportation Equity Day? So Transportation Equity Day is February the 4th this year. It's Rosa Parks' birthday. And we celebrate that, NAACP celebrates that with the Labor Network for Sustainability. And it is to lift up transportation equity issues throughout the United States. So why does NAACP engage in a transit equity, clean air, and healthy communities initiative? You can click it again, please. Yes. So, well, for one reason, we have to engage traveling while Black, writing while Black, breathing while Black. These types of issues require us to engage in this initiative because our communities and constituents are just disproportionately and differentially impacted. Next slide, please. So when we decided to do this collaborative effort, we decided that Rosa Parks' birthday would be more than appropriate to do this on because during the Civil Rights era, if you recall, it was Rosa Parks that sat down on the bus that launched the Montgomery bus boycott. And it was a year later that the court made a decision that separate seating on a bus, segregated bus system was unconstitutional. Now, please recall, and just as a point of information, prior to that time, it was in 1896 that the United States Supreme Court decided Plessy versus Ferguson. And Homer Plessy was an individual that rode the train and refused to sit in the segregated car. His intent was, and he intentionally did this, he wanted to sit in the car to integrate the white car. Well, of course, he was arrested, and that ushered in the so-called separate but equal doctrine, and that was 1896. And it wasn't until 1954 in the Brown versus Board decision that we got out from under that particular doctrine as the law of the land, and that was when it was decided that separate is inherently unequal, and again, it was reinforced by Rosa Parks' tactic and the NAACP's role in this, along with many other organizations, and hundreds and thousands of people got involved in this. So next slide, please. So as you can see, it took us a while. It took us many, many years to even have the public accommodation rights under the Constitution to have a just position for riding public transportation. And so we also have to look at the workers and the right of workers to organize, the transportation workers themselves. And a just transition, and I won't read the whole thing, also requires we uphold the rights of workers and civil rights. And this means that we should all have, workers should all have access to free or at least affordable public transportation, regardless of age, race, and class. And it also supports the right of workers to organize in this particular sector that will build, operate, maintain public transportation infrastructure as well as provide services. And this is particularly important right now, if you recall, because the transportation workers are really, really, really working in extraordinarily hazardous conditions. And if they were not organized, it would really be, I just can't even think of what that would look like in terms of exerting rights around protections during this pandemic. Next slide, please. So Karen has already expressed to you what our 3 strategic objectives are: reducing harmful emissions, particularly greenhouse gases, advancing clean and efficient energy, and strengthening community resilience and adaptation. Next slide, please. So when we say transit equity, clean air, and healthy communities, it is important for us to lift up some of the work that we have done, because the impact on workers, on communities, is very damaging to the health of people who live near roadways. Again, we have a definite number of residents that live near roadways. And with the Clean Air Force, what the Clean Air Task Force put out a study that showed that that African Americans are more likely to be impacted by near roadway air pollution, with recent study by the Center for Public Integrity finding that African American children are more likely to experience near roadway air pollution in schools. And so there's the attribution for that. And you can, if you get this, you can have the slide deck and you can read more about the Clean Air Task Force and other organizations that worked on that particular study. Next slide, please. And so according to the Union of Concerned Scientists in California, particulate matters 2.5 pollution, burdens from cars, trucks, and buses is inequitable when looking at the exposure experienced by racial groups in California. And that's just one sample of the population, of course. And if you look here rather closely, although that's a small slide there, small print on the slide, Latinx are on average exposed to 15% higher particulate matter 2.5 concentrations than average Californians. African Americans in California experience concentrations of 18% higher, than average. And while California average exposure that is 17% lower than the average of this, while Californians have average exposure that is 17% lower than the average for the state. What this means is that on average, African American and Latinx population are exposed to particulate matter that is 43 and 38% higher, respectively, than other Californians. Next slide. Excuse me. Again, this points out, this points out homes that are percentage of workers without vehicles at home by race and ethnicity. Because what that means is they rely on public transportation. And the numbers are pretty glaring, actually. If you looked at, there are 2.8% white residents that are without automobiles at home, and then the numbers just go up and up. Latinx population, 7%, African-American population is 9.5%, and Asian Americans to a lesser degree, 6.9%. But if you see, all of the people of color communities that were part of this study, excuse me, are disproportionately impacted. Next slide, please. And I always put this picture in here because this is the metro of Washington, D.C. And you can see the number of workers that take this train. And that's just the small crowd. That must be nearly before or after rush hour. And not to mention when we have the games. So we're totally reliant in the city in major ways on public transportation, but yet we have an abundance of cars on the road, and there's still plans to build highways. So we're in a fix over here. And it's going to be even more poignant, the situation we're in, as we come out of this pandemic a year and a half from now. So just transition means we want to go away from extractive systems of production, consumption, and political oppression towards resilience, generative, and equitable economies. And that's also part of the principles that the Climate Justice Alliance, an organization, a coalition of which we are a member of, also subscribes to these particular just transition principles. Next slide, please. So transition process must place race, gender, and class at the center of solution equations to make them true just transitions. Next slide, please. Affordability, redistributional funding and investment, strategies to support low-income riders. Next slide, please. Targeting transit access improvements in low-income and communities of color, preserving and improving housing affordability, and supporting and creating high-quality employment. One of the more interesting things is we were so gleeful and happy that metro stations were going to have housing, excuse me, built right over top of the metro station. How good can it get, right? And then as the housing went up more and more throughout the District of Columbia and a number of other municipalities, the housing is so totally unaffordable. It's really, it really makes a sham of the idea of people being able to have access to public transportation if you're low income, or in many cases, low income, or a person who's low income and a person of color. Next slide, please. So NAACP has 2,200 local branches, several of which are representing Southwest Virginia in this webinar. Just transitions must be organized locally, tribally, and regionally based organizations of indigenous people, African American people, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islanders, and low wealth white communities who share legacies of racial and economic oppression and social justice organizing. So in other words, we have to have a united front around this whole issue. We can't play with taxpayers' dollars because every penny counts. And like I said before, after this, as we come out of this pandemic, this is going to become even more important. Everybody is suffering from huge losses and reduced service as a result of this pandemic. But even before this pandemic, financially, there were definitely downward pressures on the economics of public transportation. Next slide, please. Go where the jobs are. I love that. That's I want to say I don't think it's Boston. It might be Milwaukee. Next slide, please. But I love that. And here's our team. We have a fabulous team, if I must say so myself. And we've come from various disciplines, but together, led by Jackie Patterson, we just get a lot of work done throughout the United States. Next slide, please. Yes, and of course, we always recognize our top leadership, including Karen Camplin, who is the Virginia State Conference ECJ Chair, Environmental Climate Justice Chair. I want to thank you all for your attention. Next slide. And if there are questions, of course, I'll try my best to answer them. But again, I'd like to reiterate what Karen said about the statewide transportation forum in the state of Virginia. And I'm hopeful that many of the people who have been taking part of these regional transportation webinars will become a part of that one as well. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jane, for such an informative presentation. Before we move on to Sean Tubbs, I just wanted to see if there were any questions. You can raise your hand, or we've got our panel, which is up in our chat box, which is up and running right now. We were experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties earlier. And so if you don't mind, write in your name and where you're from, and if you're with NAACP, which branch you are, in the chat, along with any questions that you have. So I'll just pause for a couple of seconds to see if there are any questions before we move on to our next panelist. JD. Okay, so let's just move on to Sean Tubbs, okay? And thanks again. And then we're gonna have an opportunity to answer any questions at the end of this, at the end of the program for about 5 or 10 minutes. So Sean Tubbs is the field representative for the Piedmont Environmental Council, and he's gonna give us a great transportation overview and talk a little bit about land use and give us that idea of why it's so integral to incorporate the two when either talking about it or coming up with solutions for some of our problems. Thanks, Sean.
Well, thank you. First of all,
1 second, Sean, can you send me your slides as an attachment, not inside of the Google?
Oh gosh, it'll take a second. If you let me, I can filibuster while I do that. That's
Okay.
I can try to make it look like I'm doing that right now.
Perfect.
Yes. Good evening, everybody. My name is Sean Tubbs, and I am with the Piedmont Environmental Council. Real quick here, I don't actually know how to save that. Give me a quick second. Wait, I'm not sure if I can actually do that easily. Sorry. Is there any way to share the screen? If not, I can just talk. I think we can probably just go through it. It's fine. I'll be happy to share it with afterwards, if that makes any sense, maybe, or can we try the screen?
What is it that you have, Karen? Do you have a PDF? Can you still?
I did it in Google Slides. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know you couldn't save it back to PowerPoint.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't open it.
That's okay. Let's just I can give them afterwards. It's fine. I can just talk real quick. You just have to see my face, which is fine. I'm Sean Tubbs, Piedmont Environmental Council, but I'm very excited to be on this particular call this evening without the slides, which is fine. mostly because I'm very interested in the details of how we get to the actual implementation of these systems. Just a little bit about myself. I'm not a planner. I'm a journalist, or was a journalist. I now work for the Piedmont Environmental Council, but very interested in the details of how you make these transportation systems work. As Jane English said, every dollar counts. And unfortunately, sometimes you end up in situations where the actual solutions, actually getting people on functional systems, sometimes falls backseat to other issues. And I'll just talk a little bit about PEC real quick. We are an organization that covers 9 counties, spanning from Loudoun County down here to Albemarle. If you could see the map, it just basically goes down the US 29 corridor, and we're at the southern tip of that. Charlottesville, of course, is the University of Virginia, Albemarle County, and we have some interesting issues here with transit, which we'll get to in a minute. Why would an organization like PEC care about this? In Albemarle County, we have there's a growth management policy that has been on the books now since 1980. There were some issues with the water supply. There was a reservoir that was silting in, and aggressive, well, let's just say 20th century non-thinking practices about how to use the land led to a lot of sedimentation that clogged up the reservoir, or would have clogged up the reservoir. At the time, the county had plans, Albemarle County had plans to develop all around it. That's not the topic we're speaking tonight. We're here to talk about transit. But the issue with that, though, as we get to this, is let's talk a little bit for a second about why I'm interested in the subject matter for this, which of course is Southwest Virginia. Southwest Virginia is home to Virginia Tech. I'm a graduate of Virginia Tech. I graduated in '95. I became a reporter at Virginia Tech, very interested in the details and the intricate details of a lot of these different issues. And I really learned how to, but I also took the bus. The transit, the 2-town trolley, was the way I got around and the way I got off of campus and into, well, the New River Mall at Christiansburg. I did some research today and I see they've expanded that. We'll touch on that in a minute. But for me, it's the idea about making these connections and how to figure out, it's a question of access, and it's a question of who gets to ask the questions. And in some cases, I found as a journalist that gave me a role to be able to ask the questions. And frankly, I would like to see more journalists. I'd like to see more citizens who are able to understand the jargon that we have and that we use. I believe that's one of the biggest issues that we have, is that this stuff is all technical. And sometimes the planning processes that we have look like they're being open, but maybe they're not. And what I'm interested in is educating people about how we can actually get to solutions and get people out of their cars. Obviously, in this COVID-19 era, I was a committed transit writer. I live 1.5 miles away from work, and I stopped driving there, mostly because I could, and I tried to encourage other people to do so. But here in this community, I'm going to touch a little bit about this community and how it might compare to Blacksburg and some of the issues there. Real quick here, I would say, but again, going back to like being a student in the early 90s and wondering why they were doing things. Many of you there might recall that there was the Smart Road project that was going to go through the Ellet Valley. Didn't really have much of an idea about how that thing really came about. So I did some early reporting on that. And that really led me to a career where other people are going to talk about I-81, which is a situation where, as a reporter for WVTF Public Radio, they've been talking about that solution. They've been talking about solutions for ages, but as some others are going to talk about, there are some issues maybe with some access and which will come with that in the future regarding the roads. Here in this community, I'm going to make one comparison to this community, which is now I didn't get to do the exhaustive look at your transit community that I wanted to, but and I'm very much looking to make connections and to help you all with that. And the reason is because here in this area, I want to fix our transit system. Part of our transit system is, well, we really have 3 agencies. We have the University of Transit System, which covers just the University of Virginia. You have Charlottesville Area Transit, which covers mostly central Charlottesville, which is about 10.4 square miles. and then and some crossover into Albemarle County. And then we have Jaunt, which is a nonprofit that runs paratransit service. Unfortunately, those three are supposed to work better together. And if you could see one slide that I'd be showing right now, there was a study in 2016 that said that's what they would be doing. They would be working together to make sure that these systems work and that there was efficient money. They could share resources on things such as the best way to electrify the bus system, all of those various things. The other slide I would be showing you right now is the news coverage from last October's Daily Progress, where that's all breaking down. And the director of the Charlottesville area transit actually used the words, and I hated that he said this because I'm a former reporter and you just don't say things like this, our system is in a death spiral. You don't want that, especially at a time when ridership was already down, when there was already serious concerns about can they keep the system. Now with COVID-19, there has been a boost of funding for transit systems through the CARES Act that will basically keep the systems going here for another year. But the question is, how do those systems work, and do the buses go to the right place? And looking at your system, obviously I'm not there, but the fact that that some of the things that are embedded in your land use, in your legacy land use things over the past boundaries for the last 50 years is that, so for instance, Blacksburg is a town that's part of Montgomery County. So right there, you have a natural synergy for those to work together. Now I looked at the transit development plan, and again, Blacksburg Transit mostly just covers Blacksburg and Christiansburg. However, if you look at the plan, and this is kind of what I'm getting to the engagement part, if you look at the plan, there are all of these things that are in there that list out new services that might happen. What's incumbent upon all of you or anybody, but it's hard work, and I realize that because there is that jargon, is to figure out, well, where are they going? Are they going to the right places? Are we really getting people to where they need to go? I don't necessarily know how it works there because I didn't get to that part of the research. But here with Jaunt, you call up, you pay a fee, and they come and get you and you go. And you have to qualify for that. But Jaunt is also a very aggressive, they're trying to change the way they do business with paratransit. So I would just say in that part is that, is that paying attention to all of these details of how this stuff works is important. And I think that in some cases, we come across another issue in our community writ large, I think, which is that we don't really have media coverage of this. And this is echoed by the fact that when I tried to reach out to the Roanoke Times reporter who covers the New River Valley today, he's on furlough. So at a time, I don't know if there's a big pressing transit issue there today, but again, I think we rely too much on commercial media to do a lot of that work. And some of our organizations can maybe do some of the training and some of the work to basically ask, what's a transit development plan? Why are they switching over to the transit strategic plan? All of these various things. How do the various systems work together? How do they interlink with intra-city bus and intra-city rail? I see that the person after me is going to speak about rail. It was really cool to see in the transit development plan today that there's talk of a potential Amtrak station. In other words, some of these plans have already been there. And I think sometimes a lot of planners don't get a lot of eyeballs on the work that they're doing. Well, it's crucial that we get these eyeballs on these things because, I'm going to make a confession here, not a transit expert, just a reporter, but I really think our world is lacking in reporting. And that's not a knock on the people who do the reporting. I did reach out to somebody else who I won't name, another reporter, because this, I believe your jurisdiction or for this branch, it does cover Floyd County. I did reach out to some people just to kind of find out, hey, what's it like down there? And the quote I have, and now that I'm no longer sharing the screen, I can just read the quote if you don't mind, which you could see in this slide. And this is a quote from somebody today, because the problem's real. The question is, how do we get to the solutions? Anyway, the quote is, "A lack of reliable transportation is a huge problem in rural Floyd County because it precludes people from securing jobs and accessing public services. Because the county is so large and so folks live so far from the center of town, where most jobs and services are congregated, Floyd has no public transportation, and many people are priced out of owning cars. And you saw the slide that Jane English showed earlier about that. So in our rural areas, we do have to pay attention to this. And again, sometimes for me, that's a matter of just saying, I don't know the answer, but let's work together to get to the question. Now, I don't have my slides. I'm going to make sure I covered everything. I think I probably did a better job without the slides. I'm sorry you didn't get to see the pretty pictures. There were lots of buses. But I want to touch on land use planning for a second. And this is important for our area. I did try to pull up the comprehensive plan maps for Blacksburg, but I can talk extensively about the problems that we have here. So in land use planning, we want to make sure that we're putting, thinking about where we are now, 2020, looking ahead to 2030, 2040, 2050. We have this vast expanse of commercial shopping centers from the 20th century, which are just sitting there pretty much doing nothing. Now, the developers would have you think that the heyday of retail is coming back, but that's a pipe dream. We have to figure out how to work with the property owners and how to actually maybe get them to sell, possibly to some better people who would be willing to take some risks. And we need to figure out a way to make them houses. But none of that will work without transit. And the situation that I've been raising here in this state and trying to is that we have to work together on those issues, because, and a case in point, at a recent rezoning, which is mostly what I do is cover land use things, at a recent rezoning, the perfect spot that the comprehensive plan called for density. The neighbors show up and they say, oh, they're going to drive, it's going to be awful. I showed up and said, oh, we can fix the transit. We can fix the transit. The problem is that particular rezoning was just over the border in Albemarle County. And right now, there's no guarantee that CAT, the Charlottesville Area Transit, is going to run a bus there. Jaunt might run a bus, but do we really want to have two competing bus systems in the same area? I'll go back to what Jane English said. Every dollar counts, and this is public money. It's a public trust, and we have to figure out a way to put it to work for everybody. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much. I know I left a little time, but.
Wow, Sean, that was very informative. And thank you for demystifying transportation, actually, and bringing it down to what riders and drivers and bicyclists and walkers, what is important to them. And it is important to try and get everybody to be actively involved in the decision-making process. And you're right, we can't rely on the commercial media. You're absolutely right on that. And I was really excited to hear you encouraging that, there are things that can be done. Writing a letter to an editor about something that is impacting you. It could even be just something on your neighborhood. It doesn't even have to be a massive project. Mm-hmm. It can be saying, why am I not getting bike lanes where downtown they're putting all of this money into putting bike lanes on every street, and yet I don't even have a sidewalk. And there's a letter to the editor on that, or some kind of opinion piece. So
it's also, just to demystify a little bit more, it took, I went to Virginia Tech and I learned this stuff, and I was a reporter for a while, but I never knew how planning worked. And I really think that our planning structure is just underreported, and the citizens don't know. They don't know that there are things called metropolitan planning organizations where they have the right to go in and speak at those meetings. And I guarantee you, if you look, and this is, well, actually don't do this because it might not work, but I'm a paid advocate, and I'm generally the only person who speaks at those meetings. It's got to change. It's got to be more than just that. We have to get people with real stories to make sure that the elected officials know that transit just isn't a luxury. Bike lanes aren't a luxury. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and I'm pleased to be here with you doing it.
Great, thank you.
And please reach out. Lots of questions.
Yes, and so I do have a question here. Carl Blue, he just logged on, but he wants to know if the recording will be made available and if we're going to share the webinar. And yes, we are. And we had some technical difficulties with Sean, but we will be attaching a copy of his presentation. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get the graphics as part of the recording. But we will share his pictures of his buses. Do we have any questions or? Okay, with that, I see, feel free to write questions in the question and answer session. You're welcome, Carl. Or write your, okay, are there legislative initiatives we should be pursuing for the next General Assembly? And this is Robert Beckman who is asking this question. Who wants to take that? I can take that. And I'll do this quickly, and we can talk about this more at the end because transportation is such an impressive and massive sector. There are a lot of legislative initiatives, such as we can do a Clean Car Advance Program, in which we combat greenhouse gas emission through supporting, low to no emission standards for automobiles. There are, funding initiatives that we can support. We can support rail initiatives and so many other things. Elizabeth Guzman this year had passed House Bill 585, which is, it mandates localities to implement transit-oriented development strategies as part of their comprehensive planning processes. So this is going to kind of help address some of those localities that did not incorporate or consider these types of transportation and transit projects that we're discussing here today. There is more work that needs to be done. There's an equity piece that needs to happen. How do we make sure that our resources are allocated in a more equitable manner? So let's everybody, all of our panelists, please remember that question, and let's pick it up at the end of the program where we can talk about it in a more robust way after Danny and Trip and Kim speaks. I don't see any questions, but I see Danny is ready to go. So I guess I'm going to hand it over to Danny. Danny he's wearing two hats today. He is currently the Executive Director of Virginians for High-Speed Rail, as well as the Deputy Director for Virginia Transit Association. And I think you're still, oh, okay.
Yep. Thanks, Karen. Having done a million of these now, I learned just to keep myself muted until the last second, especially with a toddler that's getting ready to go to bed. So thank you, everyone, for also allowing me to kind of jump in a little bit later. I wish I would have been able to be here for the whole meeting. I am going to attempt, so I am unable to share my screen. It says host has disabled that.
It's okay. I have your slide.
Okay, excellent.
Or I had it. Wait a minute. There we go.
Excellent. So I'm, as Karen said, I'm Danny Plugger. I'm the Executive Director of Virginians for High-Speed Rail. I'm also Deputy Director of Virginia Transit Association. I have been in this field almost 15 years, mainly with VHSR. I joined VTA last year, and I split my time between the two organizations. There's a good cohesiveness between the two. They really go hand in hand, that last mile connectivity to intercity travel options. So next slide, please. What I wanted to do a little bit was first give everybody a kind of background on where we were before COVID hit. We in Virginia and the transportation advocates came out of this last General Assembly very excited, very elated. We had helped pass one of the most comprehensive bills, which I will get into in a little bit. But, you know, we were really kind of poised to grow our transit and rail ridership. And then COVID hit, and all of that kind of has gone out the window. And so looking back at where we were before COVID, last year, Virginia had almost 173 million annual trips taken by transit. A large percentage of those are the Metro up in Northern Virginia, and those are only Virginia-based trips on Metro, not the whole region, as well as Tide. The bus handles a huge amount of travelers, including Sean out in Charlottesville. We have commuter rail up in Northern Virginia, VRE, and then Vanpool and Paratransit, which really does the yeoman's work for our more rural areas, handled over 4.6 million passengers. And being Virginia, we're very diversified in our transit systems. We even had ferries, which handled over 325,000 folks. And so, all in all, our transit system was growing. More trips were being taken. We were getting cars off the road, and it was making a tremendous impact. And so, next slide, please. And so, when you take all those impacts and you measure them out, our transit systems took over 1 billion miles, passenger miles off of our roadways, reduced carbon pollution by over 130,000 metric tons, reduced fuel consumption by nearly 14 million gallons, and generated about $2.8 billion in economic developments, or economic benefits and development. Well over $3 for every dollar invested in transit here in the state of Virginia. That equated to about 100,000 cars. Sorry, back a couple slides. Okay. And so all in all, our transit systems here in Virginia, we're making a tremendous impact. So next slide, please. And then when we look at passenger rail, which is our Amtrak trains here in the Commonwealth, our trains on average handle about 1.6 million passengers. Before COVID, we were actually on pace for the highest ridership in the history of the state of Virginia. Our regional trains were on pace to break 1 million riders. Our long distance trains were on pace to reach their highest numbers as well. Ridership was up about 20% year over year. And then COVID hit, and that has all changed, as I mentioned earlier. But when you look at the impact of our passenger rail trains, they took almost 500 million passenger miles off our roadways. Most of these are long distance trips. The average trip is about 325 miles. They generated over $775 million in economic benefits, reduced fuel consumption by over 16 million gallons, and reduced carbon pollution and greenhouse gas emissions by over 147,000 metric tons. And so all in all, when you combine the two, our two rail and transit systems we're doing yeoman's work. And so next slide. So I'm a data guy, so my apologies. I know it's after dinner, so hopefully nobody falls asleep before my good friend Tripp gets on, if I don't put anybody to sleep. But I wanted to give a little overview now that everyone has an understanding kind of where we were, both transit and rail, what happened in the General Assembly, and what has been the impact of COVID-19 on our transit and rail systems. So next slide, please. In this last General Assembly session, we passed, or the General Assembly passed, and a lot of us advocated for and worked very hard for the passage of Governor Northam and Speaker Fillercorn and Senator Saslaw's Transportation Omnibus. It was one of the most comprehensive pieces of transportation legislation, really, in a generation. And what it did was it took all the funding sources here in Virginia that were in a mishmash. 1% of sales tax went to rail, and this percentage of the gas tax went to transit, and this percentage of the gas tax went to roads. And it was just this spaghetti string funding formula. It brought all the revenue into one pot and then divided it out by percentages. So it helped mitigate any rising or any issues that may come about because of an impact to one funding mode over another. Let's say gas prices go up, people drive less, they buy less gas. That's less revenue for pot X. And so what this omnibus did, in addition to generating more revenue, was it created a more streamlined funding formula and brought a lot of transparency to how we fund transportation in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so once all the money was brought together, 51% was taken off the top for our federal highway maintenance program, which is, I believe it's federally mandated. When Tripp gets on, he'll know a little bit better than I. 49% is then divided up into all the different pots, with transit getting 23%, rail getting nearly 8%. And what that means is that transit ended up getting an additional almost $119 million a year, and rail ended up getting about an additional $40 million a year. Over the 6-year plan, which is how Virginia does their transportation program, transit would have ended up getting almost an additional $700 million, and rail almost an additional $250 million. And so Virginia really was kind of, and the vast majority of the increases went to rail and transit. And so some did go to more roads, but in regards to the larger percentage, it went to rail and transit. And so previously, before COVID-19 and the changes in our budget, rail and transit was looking at getting about $5.5 billion, and the 6-year plan worth of improvements and projects. The omnibus also created a Virginia Rail Authority, which is something that Tripp and I have been advocating for almost 2 decades, and it receives 93% of the total rail funding off the top, and that's really going to be the vehicle for the state beginning to own rail corridors in the state, in the Commonwealth, and that's something that hasn't happened since Doug Wilder sold the RF&P, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad in the early 90s. And so the state is getting back into the ownership of rail corridors, including the Buckingham branch, which goes through Charlottesville, and they're buying a percentage of the I-95 corridor from Richmond to DC and buying the corridor from Petersburg to North Carolina. And so this is a historic first. It really allows Virginia to kind of control their own destiny. It also creates a transit ridership incentive program for regions of 100,000 or greater. And this program does 2 key things. It identifies and supports regional corridors of significance. And so right now, places like Sean mentioned in Charlottesville, where you have 3 different transit systems, they don't necessarily work that well together. And so CAT is really limited in serving into Albemarle. Here in Richmond, where I'm based out of, we have transit routes that end on a border between jurisdictions, simply because one jurisdiction doesn't want it and the other one does. And so people have to get off at that border, and if they have to walk a mile or 2 to get to their job, in the opinion of some localities, that's fine. What the state really kind of realized was that those corridors have an importance beyond just local government infighting or regional infighting. And so they set aside 25% of all the new transit money is going towards this transit ridership incentive program to support those corridors of regional significance. And another percentage of that is also going towards reducing or eliminating fares for low-income Virginians, giving them free transit passes. And so combined, that's a very strong program and one that we were strongly supportive of. Next slide, please. In addition to the omnibus, there was also a few other things that came out of the General Assembly that we're very proud of. First, Richmond got to join Hampton Roads in Northern Virginia and I-81 in the creation of a regional authority. A large percentage, or 15% of the funding to that authority, is automatically directed to transit. Hampton Roads, their regional authority, they got no transit funding when it was originally created. So the fact that a percentage is locked in, a floor percentage is locked in for transit funding is significant. And that was anticipated to generate almost $200 million over the next 6 years for transit here in Richmond. Hampton Roads also created their own regional transit program, and that was led by Senator Louise Lucas, who is really a huge advocate of ours and a true godsend in the state Senate for transit and for rail. And that program was anticipated to generate about another $35 million for transit in Hampton Roads, which would have generated a little bit over $209 million, around $208 million for transit down there. And Hampton Roads is unique in that each locality has to actually pay for transit in their own system. There is no regional collection or collaborative down there. And so this funding is really going to go towards building a more cohesive transit system down there. And then the last thing, which is a Virginia Transit Association program, was we helped secure $2 million over the next 2 years from TANF money, which is helping needy families. And that funding is going to giving grant transit passes for low-income Virginians, as well as Virginians trying to get to work. And there's not going to be necessarily a mandate on how long. A lot of the TANF programs you roll out after 3 months or 6 months. We're looking forward to creating a program that's going to be a little bit longer term. So allowing folks to really get on their feet and get themselves climbing back up the ladder before they have to start buying their own transit passes again. And so we're still working on what that program will look like. But all in all, we are anticipating about an additional $70 million in new regional transit funds outside of the omnibus. So all in all, as you can see, we were very excited about all our achievements this year in the General Assembly. Next slide, please. And then COVID-19 hit. It has impacted our transit and rail systems. Amtrak's ridership is down 98% across the board. A lot of our transit systems up in Northern Virginia Metro is down 90%. A lot of our other transit systems are down 80+%. The only one that's really kind of sustained their ridership, which is not necessarily a good thing because you want people to social distance and to be safe and be healthy, has been GRTC here in Richmond, which serves our MCV, our major hospital. And so a lot of healthcare workers take GRTC because MCV and VCU give out free transit passes. And so a lot of them were relying on GRTC, and thankfully they're continuing to do service and make sure that those employees can get to work, our essential workers. Congress passed the CARES Act a few weeks ago, or I guess about a month now, which included $25 billion for transit and about $1 billion for rail and Amtrak. Virginia ended up getting about $500 million of that funding, most of it going to Northern Virginia, some of it, about $70 million, going to Hampton Roads, about 36 going to Richmond, and about 94 going to the rest of our systems, including Blacksburg Transit, Pulaski Transit, and Valley Metro. And so that funding can be used to cover any of the negative impacts from COVID-19, increased cleaning, making sure that you keep all the employees on the payroll so that you're not firing folks and that you have them ready to get back to work when the time comes. But one of the things to keep in mind is due to the decline in revenues, due to the decline in ridership, current estimates have revenue to our rail and transit systems dropping by nearly $100 million a year over the next few years. And so all the gains that we made this past General Assembly session, at least right now, the projections have them all being wiped out. And that doesn't include the nearly $100 million plus that our transit systems collect from Farebox. A lot of our transit systems, I believe all of them, have gone fare free. I know GRTC in Richmond is staying fare free all the way through the fall. And so that's a huge source of revenue that our transit systems are no longer able to collect. And so the impact of transit and rail is going to be even greater due to making sure that the passengers and our employees stay safe. And so with that, I will, I think that is my, one more slide. Next slide, please. And so kind of outlining our organization's priorities over the next couple of years, it really comes down to safety and ridership. With ridership really taking a hit, rightfully so, as people stay home and stay safe. That is going to be the key for us, is how do we bring people back, get them back on transit, get them back on our trains, and that's going to tie right back to safety. Making sure everyone feels comfortable on a metro, on a subway, on a bus, on an Amtrak. And so we're going to have to keep these safety precautions in place, I believe. We're going to have to figure out best practices, not only here in the United States, but look at what other countries who have faced similar issues, previous pandemics, see how they brought their transit back and what can we learn. and start implementing those across the board, not only in Virginia, but across the United States. And so we're partnering with a lot of our national partners to try to figure out what are those best practices and bringing them here into Virginia. And so with that, I'll be glad to take questions and answer what I can. Thank you.
Danny, there was one question David Travis Jr. Raised, and that was, there have been conversations regarding passenger rail returning to Christiansburg.
Yes.
Can someone comment on that, please?
So there is a very long-winded answer, but the train is coming. It has most likely been delayed a little bit because of COVID-19, but the additional train out to the New River Valley, that train slot is part of the I-95 or the rail program that the governor announced. If you remember last December, the governor made a huge announcement that we were buying the I-95 rail corridor, that we were buying or expanding the Long Bridge, which is a multi-billion-dollar project, and it bought additional train slots. And one of those train slots is anticipated to be brought through Roanoke and extended out to Christiansburg and the New River Valley. And so it's coming. It's a little delayed. It's also going to be, there have to be negotiations between Virginia and Norfolk Southern on finalizing that train slot between Northern Virginia and New River Valley, but it's advancing. It's not frozen at this time. It has been frozen for a while. And I also want to highlight, Trip just joined us. And for everybody out in the New River Valley and Roanoke, if you want to congratulate or thank anybody for that train, Trip is the one who really fought for it. If y'all all remember the 29 bypass through Charlottesville, that big fight when the bypass was killed, there was that additional money left over, and Trip was part of the program or part of the working group. I decided how those investments were going to be spent, and he fought for that second train through Charlottesville, Lynchburg, and eventually out to Roanoke that is going to be extended to New River Valley. And so everyone should give him a round of applause for fighting for that train and getting it really kind of started.
I have one more question before we transition over to Trip and Kim, and this comes from President Travis. What safety standards are currently in place for public transit, i.e. spacing of feet-in, mask, etc.?
Absolutely. So I will answer on both sides. On the passenger rail front, Amtrak is mandating all masks on trains and at stations. They are not taking cash any longer on their trains. They are also only selling 50% of capacity on any train. So if a train can handle 100 people, they're only selling 50 tickets, no matter what. And so that way they can help everybody social distance, especially as we start to open up the economy back again. On transit, they have gone fare free, as I mentioned before. There's a lot of videos from all our different transit agencies who have shown all their additional cleaning, all their additional sanitation. The employees are wearing masks. A lot of our transit agencies on the buses, the ones that have been able to, have put up shields between the passengers and the driver to help mitigate or reduce contact. But I think, you know, there are suggestions that the buses shouldn't hold more than X number of people. So if a bus can handle 50 people, there shouldn't be more than 20 or 25 on it. However, regrettably, just due to the lack of investment that, you know, we vote, I would say as a country, we really don't have the capacity. And so we've had to reduce routes so that we can get the capacity on different routes to allow for some of that social distancing. So I think that will be an opportunity for the future as well. Buying more buses, hopefully environmentally friendly buses, electric, and other earth-friendly energy sources, so that we can social distance and have fewer people on the buses for the routes that need them, while trying to rebuild ridership. It's really kind of a chicken and egg situation.
Thanks, Danny. We have a couple more questions in the chat, but if it's okay, we'll just put a pin on those, and then we'll switch over to Trip and Kim and ask them to present on I-81, and then we'll open it up for everybody for the whole group question and answer, and then we can go back to these two, as well as the one that everybody should be thinking about, which is what are the legislative efforts, what we should do in 2021. So with that, I would like to introduce Trip Pollard, who is currently the senior attorney and the land and community program lead for the Southern Environmental Law Center, as well as Kim Sandham, who is the Rockingham County coordinator and transportation lead for the Alliance for the Shenandoah Valley. And thank you, Trip. Thank you, Kim. I'll hand it off to you both.
All right, thanks. It's great to be with you all this evening. I'm just going to talk a little bit about I-81, and then I know it's getting both late and we want to have some time for questions. So I will go through a long saga fairly quickly and then open up for questions. I-81 issues have been with us for generations. As those of you along the corridor know, it seems like it's been forever. We've been talking about I-81 and what to do with it. I first got involved about 18 years ago in opposing one of the proposals at that time to essentially double the size of I-81 from one end of Virginia to another, adding 2 more lanes each way for over 300 miles. Joined with a number of groups to fight that proposal, which ultimately was defeated. But it remained VDOT's operating plan for many years was to add 4 lanes on I-81 and essentially double the size, which would have had enormous impact, exacerbating already the pollution and traffic on that road. As everyone knows, I-81 has its problems, safety issues primarily, and a lot of that stemmed from the fact that the highway still to this date is below its design capacity for cars, but many times the trucks that it was expected to handle. So given that, the idea of just doubling lanes is not really both it's environmentally going to cause problems with more air pollution and health issues. It's going to cause destruction of communities and resources, both natural and historic, along the way. And it's not going to really solve the problem. So we joined with a bunch of groups to instead propose, and Kim Sandham, who's also part of this webinar, and will be able to answer questions and add in when I'm finished. So a number of groups got together and we developed what we call the Reasonable Solutions Package as an alternative to the VDOT double the size of I-81 plan. And some of the highlights of that approach were to complete spot improvements on 81, because there clearly are issues. Things like climbing lanes, where trucks going up steep grade do cause backups and safety issues. We designed some of the exits, which frankly don't meet modern design standards, and that would help address both safety, and then you have a few choke points, relatively few, along the interstate where you have fairly frequent congestion. The other thing, one other elements that we've been proposing for years has been to increase meaningful transit options, both in urban and rural areas, as a way to get some of the local traffic off of I-81. A lot of the areas where it's congested, Roanoke, Christiansburg, up north Harrisonburg, and places like that, fair amount of it's the local traffic. And we need a way to better serve some of that than having those cars get on to I-81. So transit is a piece that's been missing in that corridor. And then a third piece was to pursue implementation of a rail component. As I mentioned, it's the growth in trucks that are really causing the problems on 81 for the most part. There's a rail line owned by Norfolk Southern that parallels most of I-81 throughout Virginia, all the way up into New England and south. And so the idea that a number of groups came up with is to promote improving that rail line as a way to get some of those trucks off of 81 and get some of that freight onto rail. So this was our alternative vision. We've been working for a number of years to promote this alternative vision. What has happened is, fast forward to very recently, we ultimately were able to defeat the plan to double the size of it. The General Assembly a couple of years ago directed the Commonwealth Transportation Board and VDOT to come up with a new approach and a new plan, one that was more feasible, both fiscally and also in terms of community, health, and environmental impacts. And a plan was developed, and the Commonwealth Transportation Board, which is Virginia's independent transportation policy board, adopted it in 2018, so just 2 years ago. It's about a $4 billion wish list of projects, and then about $2 billion of projects that were prioritized to fund. And for the most part, it adopts more of our approach that we'd argued for years. It's not wholesale widening, although there definitely is road widening and more asphalt than we would like. It does have a chunk of money set aside that we argued pretty hard for rail and transit improvements. It's relatively small. Out of that $2 billion, it's about $150 million. And it also created a new I-81 steering committee to help oversee this process. But the plan is the one the Commonwealth Transportation Board adopted, and then last year the General Assembly essentially blessed and funded in part through higher gas taxes and other things along the corridor. In this year's session, 2020, the omnibus transportation bill that Danny just mentioned did have a provision that allows that revenue stream to be bonded. That will jumpstart some of the projects. The projects that are moving first, though, are the ones that are more improving the corridor in terms of its efficiency, messaging and signing when there are accidents that cause such a great backup. And one of the things that some of the projects are going to do is create ways to get around some of the places where accidents tend to happen more often to alleviate that backup. So it's not a perfect plan. It's far better than the one it replaced. There are some widening, for example, down in and around Montgomery County that are in that plan. One is just adding an acceleration lane. It's about a half a mile project. But then the main widening is, it's about altogether 16, 17 miles from mile marker 119 to 136 that will add one additional lane, not two, which was VDOT's previous plan, but we'll add one additional lane, but only on the northbound side, which is where more of the congestion, more of the accidents have tended to happen. So this is a more data-driven process. It is a big step forward. It's not perfect. And so that's where we are today. We have this plan in place. There is a revenue stream for it. Like most revenues, it's going to be behind projections a bit, given the current economic situation. But it's a far, far better plan than what we've had in the past. And again, most of the projects that are moving forward have been, first at least, are the smaller projects. There will be others down the path that I think we and other groups are still going to try to get changed or improved. So 81 remains an issue. There is a much better plan in place, but it does remain something that all folks along that corridor need to keep a close eye on and keep pushing for those alternatives, targeted road improvements, more transit in the corridor to get some of the traffic off, and then ultimately freight rail. That's going to be a little farther away right now because of some issues with Norfolk Southern. That's the big part of the plan. So I will stop there. And Kim, I don't know if you had anything to add.
I think that was a good summary trip of a long saga, like you said. The one thing that I think is worth just highlighting that you already mentioned is that there is a committee that is essentially administering the I-81 plan, and it's scheduled to meet quarterly. And it's a public input opportunity, and it's also an opportunity for accountability. So it's important to know that there is at least some mechanism to see what projects are being discussed, how are they being prioritized, and keep an eye a little bit on the scale of those projects as well. Once they work through their $2 billion list, that's when the process essentially starts over again. They've got other projects on their wish list, and it'll be important to make sure that they are appropriately targeted, data-driven, with public input that aren't out of scale. Because with a standing revenue stream, now we end up with the possibility of not always having a project, not just a project when there is funding.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Did you have anything else, or?
I did not. I was Tripp's moral support.
So we covered it, I know, a lot of ground very quickly, but it's already 7:25, and so I wanted to leave some time for questions for us and for others.
That's a great idea, and I hope as I go back, and I had one marked for everyone, but as I look for the questions in the chat, I just want everybody to just know that how important and how influential transportation is on all parts of our daily lives, whether it's mobility, whether it's access. And I know you heard a lot of B's and M's for millions and billions that have been dropped in which these projects are being funded. So there are business and entrepreneurial pursuits available as well. So it is really important to keep track of these projects, particularly within your community, but also making sure that if these major construction projects are occurring in your community, that there are project labor agreements, there are community benefit agreements, and there's stuff that is bringing funding to employees within your community. So that is also something that should be tracked as well. So while I was rambling, I wasn't doing a good job looking for the question. Okay, will there be increased cleaning on the trains? Will passengers be required to wear a mask for the entire trip? And this is from Angela.
Yes. As I mentioned, Amtrak is obviously doing a lot more cleaning on their trains. They're reducing capacity. So they only sell 50% of the tickets for any train. They're mandating masks on the trains, especially in the stations as well. Now they're not mandating that you wear the mask the entire trip. If you're sitting next to your spouse by yourselves, you don't have to wear the mask. But as soon as you enter any of the quote unquote public areas, they will be asking you to put the mask on.
Thank you. Has there been a, okay, wait, sorry, I'm not wearing my glasses, so I'm gonna be squinting too. Has there been a very recent breakthrough with NSRE regarding the extension to Christiansburg?
They are having conversations. Not too long ago, the conversation ceased a couple years ago. So at the last that I heard is Virginia and Norfolk Southern are continuing to negotiate, which is something that we're happy about. I'm not sure where those negotiations are at this time, but they have been having conversations, which is why I'm optimistic that there will be a train sooner than I would have said probably a year and a half ago if you asked that question.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And then this is the last question that's in the chat box, and then if anybody can briefly talk about any legislative initiatives that they should, people should be aware of and pursue in the next General Assembly, and then we can hand everything over to President Travis for closing remarks.
Tripp, do you want to chime in first, or?
Well, I think the there's going to be a number of initiatives. I think everything's going to be constrained by the budget problems. Virginia is expected to be down about $1 billion from projected revenues for this fiscal year as well as next. They're going to probably have a special session in August to revisit the budget. So when we get around to next session, I think a number of things that we had all been teeing up and hoping to take on in the 2021 session, we may have to wait a bit. I think one of the most important things is going to be to, both in this special session on the budget and in the next session, is to defend the money that we got for rail and transit in the omnibus. I think there's going to be efforts looking for money everywhere. So I think we're going to be playing probably more defense than we'd hoped. I do think there's a chance to make some progress. I'm hoping on transportation, some planning issues, and especially looking at ways to reduce the emissions, pollution from transportation. This past session, 2020 session, made a lot of progress on power plants in Virginia. Transportation, we've got some great policies that have really helped reduce pollution and provide cleaner choices, like the money for rail and transit, like Virginia has this prioritization system. But the pollution from transportation really hasn't been tackled in the same way by the General Assembly. So there are a number of proposals that are floating around. We'll see which ones surface for next session, but that's definitely one to keep your eye on. Again, those with a price tag, I think, are going to have to be put off for the most part for the future. Those are just some of the things I think we'll see next session.
If I could just say one quick thing, though, on that issue, it's going to be up to places like Southwest Virginia to really make a push for why we need to continue these things, for all sorts of reasons. Just from my perspective, I can't wait to take a train straight to Christiansburg, and because I don't want to drive. I really would rather not drive there. And I think that now that I get to thank Tripp for the work that he has done with that second train set, I do think it's crucial to make sure that we continue to remember that, and to remember that's an obligation that we have to keep moving forward. And the more that Southwest Virginia can know the benefits that come with being connected by train, which should never have gone away in the first place, but we can't let it go away now.
Good point.
Absolutely. And I reiterate everything that Tripp said. I think protecting our funding that we got in the last General Assembly, both in the upcoming special session as well as next year, as the numbers continue to come in. And then, as much as we want to be visionary, I think our first line is going to be, we're going to have to figure out how we get folks safely back on our trains and transit.
Mm-hmm.
Because if ridership collapses, it's going to make our work so much harder. And as we've all seen in the past, once something is taken away, it's twice as hard to get it back. We don't want to ever have to do that again.
I have just one question, very short, and you can email me later if you have like a really long way that we can do this. But it seems like all the money is going everywhere but kind of to Southwest Virginia, where we significantly lack in public transportation. When we look at Montgomery County, the BT really is for students, but there's other part of the county that have no access to public transportation. I think the same with Radford. We already heard about Floyd. But then as we go further, because, we stretch, all the way to almost Tennessee, how would we better advocate for more money to create some public transportation systems? Because, people have difficulties getting to jobs, finding work, which significantly affects, our way of life here.
Yeah. I think talking to both your state and local officials, the state officials, your state delegates and state senators have to hear from the local representatives that the citizens want this type of service. And I will give a shout out to Delegate Hurst, who represents the New River Valley. When the transit incentive program was being created, it was capped at populations of 200,000. And he fought tooth and nail to get it lowered so that the New River Valley was not left out. And so that funding can go towards connecting jurisdictions across boundaries to help grow that type of transit system that you're talking about. But you know, a large percentage of Virginia does have some sort of transit, not great, not a lot. And so it's supporting those and growing those and expanding those into other communities that don't have it. So talk to your local representatives, talk to your local supervisors and counselors, and your state officials as well, because sometimes, you know, they don't even know they have transit in their system because nobody's ever brought it up to them before.
Yeah. And just a thing on that, Karen, I would say that one of the things that would have been in my slide was at least a picture. There was a 2016 regional study that was made. But the thing about those studies, as I said, is that just because the study was done doesn't mean people need to see it. And part of our work needs to be to make sure that people see that planners and transportation planners have thought about these issues. It's just making sure that the elected officials know it's there and they can see the benefits of funding it. Here in this community, we have seen a lot of fruit from this from that regional transit partnership that I talked about. You have the University of Virginia that again, we don't know how it's going to go COVID-19 because we don't know if they're coming back in the fall, for instance. But they had invested in a lot of the lion's share of a pilot project to run a bus over from the Shenandoah Valley. So it's that kind of thinking sometimes, which is, but again, not to belabor the point, but when we chat, which I'd love to talk with you again in the future, I can be more than happy to get down to the local level and how the local plans work and how they interface with the statewide and federal funding opportunities.
Awesome, thank you.
I think that's it with the questions. And then maybe before we move over to, because we're 5 minutes over, if everybody doesn't mind, if we do just a couple more minutes, and I apologize for going over the time. But the first thing is another option that you can do is to either join your local environmental and climate justice program and in the committee within your branch. Or another option is to join the statewide, which is me, the Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And so we are very active in tracking some of these bills and also promoting the ones that are that would promote community resiliency and vitality, and as well as supporting the clean energy and energy efficiency. So definitely we have a lot of different options, and we'll be sending out a recording of this with some follow-up information, contact information, and links to key organizations and associations that you can become more familiar with, particularly those that service your area. But before I transition over, and this might be a really great segue for President Travis, is that she had a question for Kim or anyone on the panel, that she wanted some more information about the quarterly meeting of that I-81 council that was mentioned. How, is there a link? Are they formed, and how can the community follow this or even become a part? Is there an opportunity for a citizen to become a part of this council?
There is not. The makeup of the committee is set by the I-81 legislation, and it involves state representatives and the chairman of the planning district commissions that represent the Interstate 81 corridor. So there aren't seats for the citizens. There is a public comment opportunity, however, and if you visit the Commonwealth Transportation Board website, and I can send this link to Karen if that would be helpful.
Sure.
They have the Interstate 81 study there, and they have been updating it when they have upcoming meetings. It's been a little sleepy since last fall. The idea was to have their next meeting following the General Assembly session, but as everyone knows, the spring didn't go as we planned. And so I'm not sure when their next meeting will actually be. But I'm happy to send that link.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I guess this concludes our program. I would like to say on behalf of the Montgomery County, Radford City, Floyd County branch of the NAACP, we were certainly pleased, Karen Camplin, to be co-host of this Equity and Transportation program. I would like to thank all of the panelists, Sean, Danny, Tripp, Kim, and Miss Jane. I think she's left us. But Karen, this has been a great opportunity for us to get more information. And without information, you can't look to solving any problems or coming up with any solutions. And the main focus, I think, or the main theme of all of this is that we have to be at the table. We have to get involved, and we have to find ways for coming up with different solutions. So thank you all so much for taking your time to share with us. And Karen, I did want to also say that Karen Jones is our new chair of our local ECJ committee. And so, Karen, thank you so much for all that you do. And for the audience out there, this is an opportunity to join us on this committee. It's a lot of work to do, as you've heard, but we need you at the table. So again, thank you all so much. And Karen, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but I think this ends the program tonight.
Yes. Yes. Thanks, everyone, and thank you to all of our panelists, and